Huh. Who turned off the color? Hello? I'm sorry, wait, what? I think you got the wrong number, but did you say a dragon? Is this like a code word for Mao's Chinese or the North Koreans or something? No, it's an actual dragon, and it took out a destroyer, like a US destroyer? Look, buddy, I've never met this MacArthur guy, but I doubt he's going to believe what you just told me. I mean, who'd believe a dragon took out a... Hello? Hello? Okay. November 1946. You've become a global superpower at the close of a world war, a war which, unlike your own nation, has left Europe and Asia utterly devastated, forcing countries into the unenviable spot of starting from scratch, from essentially zero. They are mostly defenseless, reliant upon your exports and military to attempt to dissuade a growing communist threat. So what do you do when a nuclear threat arises from the east unlike any the world has seen before? Well, you are the United States. And if you don't figure out a plan soon, you may just find yourself taken down to 0 or perhaps -1. Hello, I am GrayShot151 doing a very special What If featuring Godzilla Minus One. Now, I love this movie, and I can certainly look past its historical flaws to enjoy the superb filmmaking on display. But one must wonder what a historically accurate version of this story would look like. Well, today, I'll do my best to explore such a timeline. But first, for a historically accurate take, I'll first need to cover the actual time period. That way, this What If will have a solid foundation of context for all that will transpire. So, to set the stage, World War II is at an end. Japan, an empire having turned its blade upon the world merely for ruin to befall its land and people, truly is a broken nation. Blockades, firebombing, and destructive wrath of 2 atomic bombs have left the nation exhausted and in utter despair, nicknamed Kyodatsu condition by the populace. The country is even unable to feed its subjects, recommending the placement of things like sawdust and foodstuff or the consumption of small animals to assist in a daily diet. Starvation is rampant, and even with Allied assistance, poor harvests and inefficient distribution will ensure hunger remains a constant shadow plaguing the island's populace well into 1949. Now watching the film, this reliance might seem contradictory, as Allied forces are non-existent, only ghosts offering jobs and food from a distance. But I can assure you, tens of thousands of troops and bureaucrats existed within Japan during the occupation, which leads me to something attentive listeners may have already picked up on. That being, the United States was not the only nation with occupational forces within Japan, even if it was the one calling the shots for the entire occupation. United Kingdom, with mostly Australian and Indian troops, oversaw the occupation of Chugoku and Shikoku. Even nationalist China was offered to occupy Shikoku at one point, but the need to use those troops against Mao and his communist forces in the reigniting Chinese Civil War ensured that outcome never came to pass. That brief aside, by late 1946, most of the focus of these occupying countries, disregarding their own internal politics, isn't really on rebuilding Japan or really Asia in general. Their attention is primarily attuned to the solidifying Soviet sphere of influence within Europe. See, as the Soviets beat the Germans back across Eastern Europe, Soviet troops ended up occupying countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and others. And to no one's surprise, communist governments sprung up wherever Soviet armies had ventured after free elections. To be quite clear, Eastern Europe prior to World War II was no bastion of democracy. Most countries had some form of right-leaning autocratic rule, but the governments which popped up after the war were forcibly placed by the Soviets, not freely and democratically elected by the people of those states. Free elections, I should note, the Soviets actually promised prior to the war's end. Thus, fear spreads like a wildfire that the Soviet Union, and by extension Stalin, may attempt to extend his influence and his armies across all of Europe. While justified to fear such an autocratic communist takeover, there was actual little threat of invasion. The Soviet Union may have had the largest army on the continent following the war, but so too did it suffer the greatest during the conflict. Industries lay in ruin, 20 million lay dead. So another war is not as easy as you may think, even for the totalitarian state. And while a large army may have guaranteed success in the past, the Soviet Union, much like the rest of the world, quickly found itself in a new age, one of blinding atomic power. A power Stalin and his cronies sorely lacked. The United States by 1946 could unleash their stockpile of nuclear weapons if an armed conflict broke out between the two superpowers. Lacking their own bombs and facing Allied air supremacy, this was a reality that the Soviets were keenly aware of, at least for now. But why bring up all this history, you might be asking? Why explain the geopolitical machinations of a distant continent thousands of miles away from Japan? Well, put simply, it is because in the film, MacArthur and by association the United States is supposedly distracted by Soviet activity in Europe in mid-1947. The problem, though, is that with the United States holding all of the nuclear weapons in the world at this point, Stalin's hands are effectively tied. Stalin is not foolish enough to attack when the result would be his own obliteration, so he must fight on another battlefield, one of political games and proxies and espionage. A Cold War, if you will. Such an example is the Berlin airlift in 1948, when the Soviets cut off all supplies to the western portion of the occupied German capital, a crisis which Douglas MacArthur never left his residence within Tokyo for. All this is to say, Douglas MacArthur wouldn't be going anywhere, nor would the United States divisions within Japan. But more on MacArthur in the next part. For now, let's return to the film and point out our point of divergence. Honestly, there is a high likelihood Koichi Shikushima wouldn't return home for some time compared to the quick travel we see in the film. As John W. Dower wrote in the book Embracing Defeat, in the wake of defeat, 6.5 million Japanese were stranded in Asia, Siberia, and the Pacific Ocean area. Roughly 3.5 million of them were soldiers and sailors. All of these individuals naturally looked forward to returning home quickly, and their kin anxiously awaited them. For many, however, reparation would take years, not months. In September 1946, more than a year after the Emperor's broadcast, over 2 million Japanese still remain unrepatriated, and the government acknowledged that the whereabouts of 540,000 others were unknown. But this is what if Godzilla Minus One was historically accurate, not what if Godzilla Minus One did not happen. So we'll assume Shikushima returns home quickly and finds a job with the Coast Guard to clear mines. While the profession is clearly more cinematic than realistic in the film, I will note that plenty of Japanese found immense difficulty finding work after the war. This is something the film, to its credit, acknowledges, and I wanted to shout out. All other events up to the atomic tests can remain more or less the same, just with American troops actually visible in the background for historical accuracy. Small changes compared to our first true point of divergence when the first US destroyer has its calamitous run-in with Godzilla. Panicked crews send out a distress, yet their cries of terror are in vain. A few hundred sailors die from their vessel plunging beneath the waves. No survivors in sight. Unlike the film, this attack immediately raises alarms in the high command of the United States, who attempt to make heads or tails of the destroyer's final message. I mean, they would have received a message of a large undersea beast. Is it a code within a code? Something to be ignored? Every detail of the message is reviewed carefully, while nearby naval aircraft and vessels patrol for survivors or any sign of the culprit. Publicly, the Soviets deny any involvement, but privately, I can imagine their backs breaking as they attempt to bend over backwards to assure the West this wasn't them. Luckily for Stalin and his cronies, confirmation of the US's true enemy is quick when another vessel runs into Godzilla. What kind or where doesn't really matter. The upper echelon of the Soviets breathe a confused, if not beleaguered sigh, while for the United States, vengeance guides the resulting counterattack. Now, I'm not a military expert, nor can I realistically say to the detail what type of naval response the United States would enact to destroy Godzilla. But if I am certain of any outcome, it is this. Whatever response the US unleashes in men, shells, and ships, no matter how many destroyers, cruisers, battleships, or carriers are sent to kill the atomic Leviathan, the end result will not change. Hundreds of sailors perish. Massive guns strike their reptilian target, sure, but the creature's agility within the water, staggering regeneration, and own azure firepower turns what many believe as a simple mission into an unmitigated disaster. The only question is how large of a disaster this becomes. Whether compared to the largest single loss of naval personnel in US history being the Battle of Savo Island, or the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US would suffer its worst naval defeat in the country's young history. That is, if the forces meant to combat Godzilla stay to the bitter end. Luckily, history shows again and again that American leadership did not pursue such strategies during, well, World War II. Once Godzilla's atomic breath is revealed, I believe a general retreat would be called, ending the battle in Godzilla's favor. US command would be stunned by the losses, stunned that a single living creature tore apart their vessels of war like tissue paper. But whether they believe it or not, the reality of the situation is undeniable. You might be asking if this is the moment the US would begin to rearm Japan, like with the return of the Takao, and the answer is no. Now, vessels of the Japanese Navy were used after Japan's defeat, but it was more so for troop transport than any active military roles. As John Dower noted, between October 1st, 1945 and December 31st, 1946, over 5.1 million Japanese returned to their homeland on around 200 Liberty ships and LSTs loaned by the American military, as well as on the battered remnants of their once proud fleet, which does set the general vibe of Japan in 1946. While yes, Japan as a country may exist on paper, all things domestic and foreign run through the occupied powers. So the US, and that power very much wants a disarmed, pacifist Japan. Just to clarify the situation, for this ongoing crisis, Japan isn't part of the equation, they are just nearby. Godzilla attacked the United States, not Japan, and unlike the film, the United States would certainly not shrug at the loss of life and give responsibility of dealing with the creature to another nation. Naval aircraft would scout and bomb Godzilla whenever possible, while options like the use of a nuclear bomb are weighed by the highest levels of the US government, including US President Harry Truman. Thing is, time is not a luxury the US has. January 1947, Godzilla makes landfall in Ginza. Now this is months ahead of schedule compared to the film, so why here? Why now? Put simply, the wrath of a god was stoked by humanity, and thus, pain needed to be repaid in metric tons of rubble. But unlike in Godzilla Minus One, the city would very much become a battlefield as occupational forces contest the Leviathan's arrival almost immediately. These forces are comprised of the US 1st Cavalry Division. While the idea of thousands of men charging Godzilla on horseback would be something I'd love to see on screen, this is not an actual cavalry unit. The division's purpose is well-armed reconnaissance. They have access to 105mm artillery, which would be difficult to use in a city swarming with citizens. What is far more effective are the Greyhounds and Chaffies, support vehicles and light tanks respectively. Shockingly though, the Chaffies may be just light tanks compared to the Chi-2 medium tanks used in the film, but they pack just as big of a bite, if not a bit better, thanks to better munitions and barreling. While I'm mentioning the Chi-2, only 2 of the medium tanks were even completed before the war's end, and they never saw action. All this is to say, the medium tanks would not be used in this conflict. Back to the battle. The Chaffee's 75mm rounds failed to really stop Godzilla, just like the Chi-2s in the film, but the greater number of Chaffees, coupled with air support, does alter Ginza's fate. While 1st Cavalry lacks the heavy ordnance to truly stop the atomic beast, civilian evacuations occur in a more organized manner, as Godzilla will be more focused on the defenders than civilians. Also, the greater number of ground and air forces, seemingly coming from every direction, ensures that there's no full charge of the atomic ray. In its place, smaller, immensely destructive but lower yield blasts surge in every direction. Blocks are atomized on the ground while planes evade the destructive azure energy spiraling into the heavens. When the guns finally settle from 1st Cavalry's decimation, American pilots can only watch in horrific awe the destruction caused by the beast. Vengeful as they may be to what this thing has done to their countrymen, they can do nothing but aggravate Godzilla as he returns to the sea. Ginza's coastline is desolated. Civilians and soldiers turn to ash. There is no longer doubt about what terror has arisen from the sea. No mistranslation to the declaration of wrath burned through Ginza's buildings, streets, and people by the living myth called Godzilla. Japan, the United States, humanity itself is now at war. If it's not fairly obvious by the format and style of this video, I am a fan of Indy Neidell and Time Ghost's work covering the Great War, World War II, the Korean War, and the plethora of subjects they have dived into. If you're a fan of history, I would recommend going to check them out. Links are in the description below, as is John Dower's book, which I referenced for this video. That being said, the second and final part of the scenario releases in 3 weeks. So if you've learned something or if you've been entertained, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe. I'm GraySean151, and I'll see you all next time. Until then, later.